I'm glad you all were able to attend. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I want you to meet my two friends behind me. One of them is Karen Kassler, the voice of the Ohio State News Bureau, who traveled all the way from Columbus this evening for us. The other lady is a new friend of mine. Her name is Mary. Most of you might know her last name. I would find it difficult to believe that an American wouldn't know her last name currently. She has the unusual opportunity and responsibility of representing her family, and she has a viewpoint to tell us about. So without further ado, please once more welcome Karen Kassler and Mary Trump.
Hello. Hello. Thank you all for being here. This is wonderful. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, it's a great opportunity to be able to talk to you, and I really appreciate you being here. Let's start by talking about the book, and maybe we'll talk about some other stuff later. How about that?
Sounds perfect.
So I want to ask you, you've written, this is your third book, you've written about your family before. This book is a lot more personal. You detail the trauma that you went through as a member of the Trump family. Why did you write it?
You would think that I would have had an answer to that question before I wrote it, but it's actually taken me a while to figure that out because saying I owed my publisher a book that's not sufficient. And it's also not accurate. I could have written about anything. I think the main impetus for writing it, and then it got more complicated, of course, as I wrote it, was that at the end of 2023, I found myself more isolated than I had been in a long time. During COVID, everybody was. And both of my first two books were published during the height of COVID lockdowns. But in 2023, everybody was out in the world again. Everybody was thriving. People were making connections and pursuing opportunities. I was doing absolutely none of that. And I needed to figure out why. Obviously, for all of us, the last 4 to 8 years, depending on how you count it, have been quite traumatizing. But I realized that my lockdown started on November 9th, 2016. And I took it all very personally. But that still wasn't enough of an explanation. There had to be something else going on. And I started making the connections between trauma in my past to the trauma we were all suffering in the present. And I needed desperately to work through that because I felt like I was killing myself. And it didn't make any sense considering, especially because of my first book, I had all of these opportunities and I wasn't pursuing any of them.
With that in mind, was this a difficult book to write? Because you write of a lot of detail, relationships, your parents, your brother, not only your uncle, but all these other people who you were close to.
Yeah, I think in some ways the first book was more difficult because I don't consider the first book a memoir. I consider it a psychological history of a family. And as a clinical psychologist, it was not just important to me, but it was crucial that I get the psychology of the first book right. So it's very difficult sometimes to translate the sometimes what can seem jargony language of a profession into language that people can understand easily and process. This, because it was so personal, or not because it was personal, but because it was dealing with a lot of the traumatic events that sort of got me to where I was at the end of 2023, was actually easier. I mean, it wasn't cathartic, but it was easier because I'm so cut off from it still. Like, one of the great things about having complex post-traumatic stress disorder is that you can dissociate. So, it's not like I was re-experiencing any of it. It was literally like telling my story without having to feel the feelings that went along with it, which, by the way, my trauma therapist would tell you is not good.
And I think this book builds on your other two books, definitely. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of the book shows just how family and trauma really shape who you are. And for instance, you write of Fred Trump, your grandfather, Donald Trump's father, and I'm going to quote from you here. Despite the obvious favoritism he exhibited toward his middle son, in truth, he cared about Donald only to the extent that he could use him. He needed somebody with Donald's unself-conscious swagger, lack of self-reflection, and brazen ignorance of his own inadequacies to be his avatar of success in a world beyond the unglamorous and provincial precincts of Brooklyn and Queens. Donald played his role to perfection. You show how Donald Trump became a bully, essentially, but you don't make an excuse for him with this explanation.
Yeah, well, there are no excuses for him. I think I've decided I'm not pulling punches ever, but...
Good, this will be fun.
Yeah. In my first book, I did go through the developmental history of all my dad and his siblings, including Donald, and I actually do believe, well, first of all, to tell you what fabulous caregivers my grandparents were. They had 5 children, and every single one of them was a destroyed human being, and I say that in all seriousness. It's quite tragic. I think we absolutely should have compassion for the children they were, but by the same token, I know plenty of people who had much more traumatic childhoods than Donald Trump and turned out to be generous, kind, empathetic, productive members of society, or at least just, good, decent people. So, yeah, I draw the line. Like, he made his decisions, and I don't think that we need to make any excuses for him at all, because he is tragically in a position to affect all of our lives still, and that's a completely different proposition.
And you go back, his behavior goes way back. This is, you chronicle that this was behavior early on that you witnessed as you were growing up.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously it started long before I was on the planet, but, when I was a kid, he didn't care if we were throwing around a baseball in the backyard. He didn't care that he was playing with his niece and nephews who were, he's 18 years older than I am. So we were little kids, when he was in his 20s, early 30s. He still needed to win. He still needed to prove his superiority, which is why, and we played with a hardball. So that's why my brother bought me a catcher's mitt, like a for-real professional 3-inch thick catcher's mitt for Christmas one year. And I'm like, I play softball and I'm not a catcher. And I realized eventually it was so Donald wouldn't break all the bones in my hand when we played catch in the backyard.
And I think a lot of people would look at the Trump family as the wealth and the privilege and think it must have been a great life, an easy life, not difficult at all. The book really indicates that definitely wasn't your experience, but that isn't necessarily the case. Just because you're wealthy, it's not an easy life.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and obviously, I think it's true also that money makes certain things about life easier, no question. But I grew up in Jamaica, Queens, which was a world apart from Jamaica Estates, which was where my dad grew up. And I mean, I never felt like we were rich at all. I took the subway to school and we played in parking lots and stuff. So there was nothing. The only indication I had that my family might have money was that my grandfather had a chauffeur-driven limousine and a mansion that we visited every weekend. But if you live in a family in which money is the only currency, literally, when money is more important than love, when love doesn't even exist, when there's no real affection, nothing good will come of this. And we also saw how it played differently in the lives of the siblings. My dad, well, my Aunt Marianne was the oldest, and my dad was a year and a half younger. My Aunt Elizabeth was in the middle. Donald was 8 years younger than my dad. So it's like Dad and my Aunt Marianne were a different generation of siblings almost. And their experience within the family, with the wealth in the family, was very, very different. Both of them lived lives of deprivation, honestly. And it was a vastly different experience for Donald, and we see what good it did him to have all the money that he wanted at his disposal. It really
It really strikes me the lack of affection, and just the neglect, the distance, the coldness.
Yeah, it's hard to explain. Somebody asked me recently, you know, how difficult it was or how weird it was to grow up in the family. I'm like, it was my family. It was completely normal. How would any of us know that it was wrong, or that there was that there was something dysfunctional or harmful about it? And yet, despite the fact that I spent so much time at the house with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles, there really was no connection. We never did anything, you know, apart from Mother's Day and my grandfather's birthday. We never did anything with each other outside of we never went on vacation together. We never went shopping. We never went out for lunch. So it was this very circumscribed world as well. And it wasn't until I graduated from college. I was moving back to New York to go to grad school, and I'd been basically out of touch with everybody since my dad died when I was 16. You know, I went back for Thanksgiving and Christmas, but that was basically it. And I made a determined effort to repair things with my grandmother. Like I didn't really know what had happened, but I thought, you know what? The worst thing that could happen to a human being has happened to her. She lost her son. And I am going to make an effort. And we became extraordinarily close. We spoke every day on the phone. I took her out to lunch at least twice a week. And then, you know, my grandfather died, and we found out that we'd been completely disinherited. And when my grandmother found out from my Uncle Rob that we were going to hire a lawyer, because it just seemed really unfair, the last thing she said to me was, because she was extremely angry that we felt that we had the nerve to question any of this, she said to me, do you know what your father was worth when he died? A whole lot of nothing. And then she hung up on me, and we never spoke again. And, you know, my first reaction was, I can't believe she just said that about my dad. And then I realized she was actually talking about her son as well. So it was so easy for us to let each other go.
With all that in mind, the family being the way they are, the politics being the way it is, you write some very personal details here, some very intimate things. Are you afraid that that's going to come back and haunt you, that someone's going to use that against you, maybe even in your own family?
Well, as for my family, I mean, I'm not really sure how much more estranged we could be. So I think I got that covered. Mission accomplished with book one. No, I mean, honestly, the only problem Donald would have with this book is that he's not mentioned enough in it. That's my supposition there.
There are a lot of people who've experienced trauma, like you said, people who've had very rough childhoods and growing up. They turn away completely. They go no contact, they move away, they change their names. How come you have not thought of that, or have you thought about that, of leaving the whole Trump everything behind?
Well, if American democracy weren't hanging in the balance, I guess that would make it a little easier. And I did that. I did that for decades. And it was fine. I mean, it was completely fine, because they had no impact on my life at all. So I think We settled in 2001, and I had no contact. This is so weird. I was invited, excuse me, to Ivanka and Jared's wedding for some reason. I still don't know why, actually, in 2009. And then my Aunt Marianne and I started having contact, and we actually got quite close, which is weird and complicated. But other than that, like, I didn't consider myself part of this family really anymore. None of them ever met my daughter. And that was fine. Not that why would I want her to have them in her life? So I did that. And, you know, Donald was still quite famous because of, I still don't know why, but he was. But it had no impact on me. I didn't watch TV. So, you know, I was immune. And then this happened. And I mean, it took a while, but when I got approached by the New York Times in 2017, and they, you know, Sue Craig, oh, by the way, Sue Craig, Russ Butner, who wrote that extraordinary investigative report was published on October 2nd, 2018. Hope it's okay, I'm pitching somebody else's book, but their book about all of that was published yesterday. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm sure they're brilliant, so I'm sure it's brilliant. Anyway, so Sue did a brilliant job of convincing me that it would, you know, be very helpful for me to participate with them in helping them with the research for that book. And that had been the problem all along. I didn't think I had anything, and I felt like if I was going to say anything, I needed proof. Otherwise, I would just be this disgruntled niece who'd been disinherited and who's going to believe me. So they helped me get there. And actually, the truth of the matter is, I was away for trauma treatment in 2017, and I was just, you know, I was getting myself together, and I planned to do all of these things to be out in the world again. And 2 days before I was to come home after being away for 6 weeks, I fractured the 5th metatarsal in my foot, and I ended up on the couch. If it hadn't been for that, I do not know if I would have worked with the New York Times. And we would not be sitting here today. So that was really pivotal, because by then, Donald was having an impact on all of our lives on a day-to-day basis, and it was excruciating. And once I felt like I had something to show, something to defend my position, that's when I decided to write the book, because the 2020 election was looming, and I was terrified.
You mentioned your daughter. Your book is dedicated to your daughter and to E. Jean Carroll, a writer who a jury says was sexually abused by Donald Trump in 1996. She won $88.3 million in a defamation case against him. Why is she one of the two people you've dedicated the book to?
Well, first of all, E. Jean still hasn't gotten a penny of that money because the wheels of justice, you know. So that's frustrating. E. Jean Carroll is a very good friend of mine. I have enormous respect and admiration for her. And she has done, through the simple act of standing up, speaking out, and having courage, like very few people do, what nobody else has been able to do. She has held Donald Trump accountable. So that's why.
So your book ends on a hopeful note. And I just have to ask, with everything you've been through, and with everything you've been through, especially since 2016, what gives you hope?
Well, when I finished the book, I was young and naive. So it was like 6 months ago, you know. How can we not have hope? There always has to be hope. It's been a long road. It's been a very hard road. And I think part of it is just this personal sense that I can't let them win, you know? And also this recognition now, and I think this was also part of why part of the impetus for writing the book is I realized that, you know, after many, many years of being traumatized by my family, and being put in kind of unspeakably dangerous situations by my family, I was doing it to myself. And I needed to get control of that. And it's not over, you know? It's not over. We have an election coming up. We have amazing people in this country doing incredible work to save our democracy. That's been the case for decades, and it would just feel like an abdication to say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just going to go away. There's too much at stake, but also, like, we have to remember what we can mean to each other. We've been so divided and so isolated that I think the way I've been thinking of it recently is that Donald Trump, because of his pathologies, exists in this very narrow band on the continuum of human experience and emotion. It's just all anger and rage and humiliation. And for 8 years, we've been there with him. And I think one of the things that Vice President Harris has done for us is she's opened the door to the dungeon, and she's let us out in the sunshine again. And we deserve that. And we deserve to be connected to each other again and remember why we're here, you know? So we have to have hope. For all sorts of reasons, but because we're human and we want our lives to be better, and we should want everybody else's lives to be better too.
Well, you that leads into the question. There's so much to talk about in the book, but there's things that are also that are worth talking about here. I want to ask you a couple questions on your takes on these things. Mm-hmm. There was a debate recently. Oh, yeah. It's widely acknowledged that it was not your uncle's best performance. You had said in an interview right after the debate that it would be the most foolish thing he could do to show up for a second debate. And yet there was some suggestion that he might. He now has closed that door. Are you surprised that he's not going to come out and
Well, he won the first debate so resoundingly. Why? Why? Am I surprised? No. No, because this is one of the many weird things about Donald is that he, on the one hand, knows when he's lying, but then he tells the lie so much, and he needs to protect his ego, that he convinces himself that the lie is true. So he's the only person I know who can gaslight himself. So, you know, I on some level, he actually thinks that he won in 2020. On some level, he actually thinks he won that debate. But we all know that people who win debates don't go into the spin room, and people who win debates want another debate so they can win more. He can't handle it, and I think so much of what we're seeing now in terms of the lashing out, the cognitive decline, the delusional statements, the incomprehensible statements, and the vicious rhetoric are because at that debate, Kamala Harris inflicted a narcissistic injury on him from which he will never recover. So.
What do you think, I was just going to ask you, what do you think was the toughest blow? Was it the rallies comment? Was it she called him weak and confused? She said he could be manipulated for favors and flattery. What do you think was the blow? Or is it just a constant barrage?
An embarrassment of riches. Well, I think it started with, not that this was the most, not the biggest blow necessarily, but the fact that she was able to set the tone right away that put him on his back foot by crossing that stage and forcing him to shake her hand. I did not want her to do that, not tactically, but I thought it was wrong for her to have to touch him. That aside, it was brilliant because it left him even more vulnerable than he would otherwise have been. I do think that the biggest blow she landed was the comment about the rally. He's still talking about it. So, but everything else too. I mean, take your pick. It really was a plethora of things that just made him seem and feel like the small man we all know he is, and that he knows he is.
One of the comments that he made in the debate was specifically about Springfield, Ohio. And city officials, I'm not going to repeat it, but city officials have said over and over, there's no truth or evidence to that claim about legal Haitian immigrants. And it's being not only called false, but also racist. Is this shocking at all to you, even for him?
No. I said this in 2020. There's no bottom. There's no... The more desperate he seems, the worse he's going. Sorry, the more desperate he is, the worse he's going to get. And again, 4 years ago, I said if he feels like he's going to lose or things aren't going his way, he will take everybody down with him if he can. This is even more true now because so much more is at stake in this election for all of us, of course, but for him, including potentially his freedom, his fortune, and it should not surprise us, because he's been doing it for so long, that his go-to would be to attack the most vulnerable among us, the most vulnerable communities who have done absolutely nothing wrong, and whom he can other in a way that I just hate saying this, that gives him an advantage, honestly. So the only thing that surprises me is somebody as disgraceful, treasonous, and despicable is allowed to run for the presidency.
Well, he runs because he has support. So I want to ask you, he seems to have so little in common with a lot of people who support him. He's wealthy, he's highly educated, he's not a churchgoer, he flouts the law. You're a clinical psychologist. In your professional view, how is it that he got so many people in this country to swing over to him and to stay with him?
Yeah, well, in any society, I'd say, 23 to 28% of the population is sort of, the worst among us. You're white supremacists, you're Christian nationalists, you're neo-Nazis, what have you. And I kind of feel like one of the purposes of liberal democracy, small L liberal democracy, is to contain such people. Donald empowered them. Because think about this, from 2017 to 2019, 100% of the federal government, which was run by Republicans, the Republicans had the House, they had the Senate, they had the White House, 100% of the federal government championed those people. That's insane. So those diseases metastasized. So that's a much bigger percentage. It also happens to be his ceiling. So we're in the situation now where there is this, the base is still the base. There is room for people to change their minds, absolutely. However, when you think about it, those people are listening to their senators, their representatives, their governors. They're being lied to on a constant basis, just as we see what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, right? So it's very hard to break through to them. But I think at a more basic level, yes, there are those who like Donald because he hates whom they hate, right? That's the 25 to 28%. But then you have other people who have what we call authoritarian personality. They want their followers. They don't like change. They want to feel like they're being taken care of, what have you. And he appeals to that in some ways because of these myths that have been spread around about him, that he's this fabulously wealthy person who's a brilliant businessman, who's self-made. I mean, listen, who among us would not be self-made if our dads gave us $413 million over the course of our lifetimes? I, too, could be self-made under such circumstances, as trying as they might be. So that's part of it, but we have to remember that some people, and this gives me no joy, but some people like the fact that he gets away with it. Some people love the fact that he lies and he still gets his way. They love it that he has failed up so spectacularly. And, you know, that's scary. Because that completely undermines the whole idea of meritocracy. You know, when we were kids, people would say, anybody can be president. And there was a lot that was implied in that statement. If you work really hard and you believe in public service, et cetera, et cetera. Now it literally means anybody can be president. And, you know, success breeds success. So he's been enabled at every step of the way, starting with my grandfather and ending with the Republican Party. So there are a lot of people who just don't see it. So here we are.
You've written about how there are parts of this country essentially that are broken, and that we need to do a little bit of soul searching to figure out why all of this has happened. And ideally, if he is not reelected or he is not elected, that would be the time to do that. Do you feel that we have to come to grips with what's happened, and is there any possibility that we will?
Yeah, it's the same with personal trauma. If you don't go back and do the work. So for example, if you experience a traumatic event, what happened, and you develop post-traumatic stress disorder, the reason that happens is because the trauma was so great, the feelings you experienced in that moment get split off from the event. So that's a protective mechanism, because feeling those feelings is unbearable. However, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, you're still, you still have PTSD that is making your life difficult to live. You have to go back. And you have to face those feelings. You have to integrate them into yourself, or you're just going to be stuck there. There's a part of me that is stuck in a very specific location in my childhood. And if I want to go on to live the kind of life that I want to live, I have to get out of that room, right? We have to do that as a country. And part of the problem is that, we have a disastrous administration. The next administration comes in, and what do they say? We have to go forward, not look back. No, we have to look back. We have to. We have to go back so we can fix the mistakes we've made that have led us to a moment in American history where we are on the cusp of putting back into the White House the most traitorous person in modern American history, who killed over 1 million people because of his malicious incompetence during COVID, who is threatening to round up, imprison, and kill millions of undocumented workers, who is killing pregnant women through policies that he pushed through because of the corrupt, illegitimate supermajority on the Supreme Court. We're this close to doing that. We've got to figure out how to stop this insanity, or this is who we are.
You haven't just been speaking out about the possibility of your uncle being elected a second time. You're actively working with Democrats to elect specifically Senate candidates, including Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown. How is that work going, and why is that what you're doing now?
I started a political action committee 2 years ago. It's called the Democracy Defense Fund, and our mission is to elect pro-democracy candidates up and down the ballot. It's nonpartisan, although, as you can imagine, most of the pro-democracy candidates are Democrats because the Republican Party is no longer a pro-democracy party. So even though I promise you, it was not meant to be a partisan endeavor. It just so happens that all of the candidates whom we've endorsed and supported are Democrats. Sherrod Brown's a keeper. We can't lose him. Absolutely. So, I mean, it was very important to me that I can't just focus on Donald all the time. Who could? And quite honestly, he's a symptom of the problem. I mean, he's a disease and a symptom at the same time. But the problems are systemic, and in order for us to change things, in order for us to get to the point where we actually have a shot at becoming the kind of representative democracy we have it in us to be, I felt it was extraordinarily important for me to get involved in politics on a larger level as somebody who was helping pro-democracy candidates get in and do that work.